This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting from the edge of the abyss itself. In this broadcast we cast our gaze into the storm of madness, into the rift where reality unravels and gods of ruin hold court. It is not merely the tale of a warp anomaly, but of empires broken upon its tides, of demons enthroned upon mortal worlds, of a wound in the galaxy that bleeds forever into infinity. Seal your fate with a mark of subscription, or be devoured by the countless billions lost to its depths. Steel your soul, fix your eyes upon the storm, and heed this decree. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the law of the Eye of Terror. In the grim darkness of the far future, where the galaxy reels under endless war, there exists a wound in reality itself, the Eye of Terror. To understand its birth is to understand the greatest catastrophe ever to befall an ancient race, and the greatest single psychic event ever recorded in galactic history. It was not born of natural forces, nor of stellar collapse, but of arrogance, excess, and the catastrophic birth of a god. 10,000 years before the rise of humanity's Imperium, the Aeldari Empire reigned supreme. They were a people unmatched in psychic power, technology, and artistry. They tamed the stars, colonized millions of worlds, and shaped reality with a thought. No rival threatened them, no hardship constrained them. In this security they turned inward, abandoning discipline and purpose for indulgence. What began as cultural flowering degenerated into hedonism and obsession. Entire star systems were given over to cults of sensation. Worlds became temples of excess, where pleasure, pain, artistry, and perversion mingled until the distinctions vanished. The Aeldari psychic nature meant that every indulgence resonated within the warp. Every desire, every scream, every whispered hunger poured into the Imperium, feeding a gestating consciousness. The Elder thought themselves gods. In truth, they were midwives to one. Over millennia, the psychic saturation coalesced. The raw essence of excess, desire, and perfection in all its forms gathered into a single embryonic entity within the warp. Like a storm building unseen on the horizon, it grew vast, drawing strength from each act of depravity. Seers on the far-flung edges of the Aeldari realm felt the tension but were dismissed as alarmists. The craft-worlders, those few who had abandoned the decadent core worlds, sensed it most keenly. Their exile was mocked by their kin, but their distance saved them. For at the Empire's heart, the power reached critical mass. The moment came without warning. The psychic weight of trillions upon trillions of souls collapsed inwards, and in a single apocalyptic instant the warp screamed. Slaanesh was born. The shockwave of its birth rolled across the galaxy. Eldar souls, whether at their revels, in their temples, or aboard their starships, were torn screaming into the Imperium. The nascent god devoured them whole, glutting itself on the very essence of his progenitors. Entire populations winked out of existence in a heartbeat. Planets that had thrived for a millennia were now reduced to husks, their inhabitants annihilated not by war or plague, but by the hungering birth cry of a god. The devastation did not end there. The psychic detonation tore at the very fabric of reality itself. Where once the boundary between the warp and real space was firm, now it was shredded. Stars collapsed, moons vanished. The central systems of the Aeldari Empire were swallowed into the growing vortex of unreality. What remained became the Chrome Worlds, planets forever trapped within the Imperium, haunted by demons and echoes of the souls consumed. This breach widened, stabilised not by natural law but the will of chaos. Where the warp had always been a realm of dreams and madness, now it had a permanent mouth into the material universe. That gaping wound would become the Eye of Terror. From the outside it appeared as a swirling storm of impossible colours, purple nebula, crimson lightning, and dark voids that seemed to stare back at the observer. Within, the rules of physics and time ceased to apply. Suns burned with unnatural hues, constellations reformed into mockeries of faces, and space itself folded in on itself. It was not merely a storm but an entire realm, an overlapping of realities where demons walked freely and worlds were reshaped by whims of dark gods. In physical terms, the eye stretched some 20,000 light years across, the largest and most enduring warp rift in the galaxy. In metaphysical terms, it was infinite, a scar that bled chaos into the materium. Unlike transient warp storms, which flare and fade, the eye was permanent, anchored by the enormity of Slaanesh's birth. Long after, when humanity expanded during the Great Crusade, explorers encountered the anomaly. It was catalogued clinically as Cygnus X1, an unexplained void on the rimward edge of Segmentum Obscurus. Ships that approached it vanished or returned decades later, cruised aged beyond recognition or warped beyond comprehension. To most, it was marked as a navigational hazard. To the Primarch Perturobo, ever a student of terror and obsession, it was something else entirely. During the turmoil of the Horus Heresy, he gave it a name that reflected its true nature, the Eye of Terror. The name endured, spreading across the Imperium as a whisper of dread. At its heart lie the ruins of the Aeldari's once great planets. Those became known as the Chrome Worlds, Shattered husks of what were once shining capitals. They remain within the eye, twisted reflections of their former selves. Buildings grow like tumours, rivers flow with blood, and demons dance through the ruins of palaces that once celebrated art and excess. For the surviving Aeldari, the Chrome Worlds are both tomb and warning, the eternal reminder of their fall. To this day, their souls are imperiled. Every Aeldari fears Slaanesh, who still thirsts for them, and the Eye is its throne realm. The Eye of Terror is more than a geography or phenomenon. It is a monument to the consequences of arrogance. It stands as the great cautionary tale in the galaxy, that unchecked power and decadence can literally tear a hole in reality. To the Imperium of Man, it is the ultimate symbol of chaos, the glaring eye of damnation that looks out from the galactic northwest. To the Aeldari, it is their greatest shame, the wound that their race inflicted upon the universe. To the servants of chaos, it is paradise, a gate into real space, a kingdom of the gods, a promise of eternity. Unlike supernova or collapsing black holes, the Eye of Terror does not diminish with time, it persists, unhealed, a constant feature of the night sky. Imperial charts mark the region with dire warnings. Eldar seers skirt its periphery with dread. Navigators from the Adeptus Astronomica describe its psychic presence as a baleful gaze upon the galaxy. From the moment of its birth, the Eye has shaped history. It is the reason countless wars have been fought, the haven of traitors, the lure of heretics, and the nightmare of seers. But its birth remains its most chilling truth, a single instant of cosmic excess, a scream of a dying empire, and the arrival of a god. To the untrained eye, the Eye of Terror appears as a storm in the heavens, a swirl of scarlet and violet across the void. Yet to gaze too long upon it is to feel something stirring behind the sight, a pressure against the mind, as though the storm gazes back. It is no simple celestial anomaly, but a place where the veil between realities is torn asunder, where the laws of physics unravel, and where the immaterium floods into real space. Within its borders lies a realm that defies mortal comprehension. Stars shine with colours unknown to the human spectrum, their light bending and folding into shapes the brain cannot hold. Planets fracture, rebuild and fracture again. Mountains rise overnight from plains of ash, only to collapse into oceans that boil without heat. Rivers of blood carve channels across continents that were not there a moment before. The Eye is not stable, nor is it wholly chaotic. It is an ever-changing nightmare that has become its own grotesque parody of a galaxy. Worlds within the Eye are not dead, they are possessed. They are living battlegrounds where reality itself takes sides. Some are molten wastelands where volcanoes breathe with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Others are frozen spheres where time loops eternally, trapping entire armies in battles that never end. There are demon worlds sculpted in the image of their patron gods, brass fortresses echoing with the endless slaughter, pestilent gardens thick with choking spores, crystalline labyrinths that rearrange themselves at a thought, and decadent palaces where sound itself can cut flesh like a blade. Each world is both prison and paradise, depending on the allegiance of one who treads its surface. Time within the Eye has no constancy. To step into the storms is to surrender any certainty of duration. A voyage thought to last days may end a century later. A campaign waged for decades inside may conclude in real space as mere hours past. Generations may be born, live and die within the span shorter than a breath in the outside galaxy. For some it is a curse, for others a weapon. But what perhaps makes the Eye most terrifying is not its demons, nor its warped landscapes, but its accessibility. Unlike the smaller temporary warp storms that flare and fade across the galaxy, the Eye is permanent. It yawns open like a wound that cannot heal, its borders shifting but never closing. Ships can enter its depths, though few return. Explorers who once sought to chart its mysteries brought back only tales of madness. One described a sky filled with two suns, each bleeding fire into rivers that flowed upward. Another spoke of a desert where the sand whispered in the voice of loved ones long dead. Some navigators emerged blinded, their minds shattered by the strain of guiding vessels through a place where the Astronomicon cannot reach. To the common citizen of the Imperium, the Eye of Terror is less a location than a legend. For millennia, mothers frightened their children with tales of the Eye, warning them that disobedience would see their souls dragged screaming into the storms. Priests described it as a gateway to damnation, the visible mouth of gods who eternally hunger. To many, it is not even real space, but hell itself, hanging above the stars like an open maw. Yet for all its horror, the Eye exerts a fascination. To cultists, it is a beacon, a holy site promising reward for loyalty to powers beyond. To rogue scholars, it is the ultimate mystery, proof that the warp is not merely a mirror of the material, but a predator waiting to consume it. To the desperate or damned, it is sanctuary, for the Eye judges no allegiance but that of chaos. Legends speak of treasures hidden within its storms, lost technologies of the dark age of technology, ancient relics of the Aeldari Empire that birthed the rift, entire planets swallowed whole, their riches untouched by time. These tales lure fools and visionaries alike, and though most never return, enough fragments of truth escape the eye to ensure the legends endure. A weapon of impossible power here, a tome of warp lore there, a survivor who claims to have walked upon a world where the walls themselves breathed. Each story ensures the eye is not merely feared, but coveted. Yet the eye takes more than it gives. Every voyage into its depth is a gamble not only of life, but of soul. Crews report hearing voices in the hum of engines, seeing faces in the void outside their viewports, feeling the pull of unseen hands upon their flesh. Entire ships vanish, not destroyed, but simply erased, their absence leaving only silence. For every tale of plunder, there are thousands of names scratched from registries, their fate unknown, their vessels perhaps still adrift somewhere in the eternal storm, their crews still screaming. The eye is a paradox, both place and symbol, chaos giving shape, nightmare giving permanence. For the Imperium, it is the enemy incarnate, a constant reminder that the galaxy is not secure, not eternal, not sane. For those that serve the dark gods, it is holy ground, the first proof that chaos can carve its permanence into reality. And yet, despite millennia of attempts, none have charted its borders, none have mapped its heart. The eye is eternal because it is unknowable, its storms may expand and contract, its demon worlds may shift and vanish, but the wound itself endures. So it is remembered not in charts, not in data, but in whispers. The soldier at the trench line glances upward, knowing the eye looks back. The pilgrim on a shrine world lights their candle, believing the eye's glow is a test of their emperor's strength. The heretic kneels beneath it, believing its promise is apotheosis, and across the galaxy it is said that as long as the Eye of Terror still burns in the heavens, there is no escape from war. When the fires of civil war flickered and the Emperor's enemies were driven from the light, they did not vanish. They recoiled into the one place that would accept them wholly, the gaping wound at the edge of the galaxy where law surrendered to will. There, beyond sane constellations, the renegades of the Horus Heresy found shelter. Not peace, never peace, but shelter enough to sharpen blades, nurse hatreds, and learn the arts of patient revenge. The Eye became their redoubt and their crucible, a hinterland in which failure could molt into new forms, hard and cruel. They arrived as broken legions and tattered warbands, hulls scorched, gene-sized maimed or gone to the fates unspeakable. In the quiet between storms, they learned the cartel currencies of damnation. Pacts were inked in ichor and breath, oaths spoken in the names of powers that had heard their pleas throughout the long treason. A warrior had once sworn to uphold the dream of a golden empire, now swore to break it utterly, and the Eye listened. It is a place that answers vows. On certain worlds the ground remembers siegecraft. Iron keeps rise where mountains once lay, bristling with guns that never cool. There, the sons of the hammer build fortress upon fortress, each a geometry of hatred layered over the last, until continents resemble engine blocks half buried in slag. On others, cathedral labyrinths churn with liturgies older than written language. Processions of chain-massed zealots drag relic engines through ash-choked streets, while warrior priests preach a gospel of conquest to crowds already on their knees. Farther still, on a world that is more library than soil, the sky is an aurora of sigils and equations. Towers knot themselves into impossible helical keeps where sorcerers bargain for the futures of sons and teach apprentices how to unlace a man's name from his shadow. None of these places were shaped by hands alone. The masters of such realms are not merely generals, but patrons and princelings of a nightmare. Once primarchs transfigured into the avatars of the powers they courted, their will stains the bedrock, their moods ripple the weather. Under a certain plague-crowned despot's gaze, forests bulb into tumours and rivers clot into black syrup. Under the governance of a primarch who speaks in schemes and prophecy, streets rearrange themselves to please a whim that has not yet been thought. The Eye grants tenure to tyrants. Around such citadels gather the teeming multitudes who feed the armies of the damned. The lost and damned do not think themselves lost. They think themselves chosen. They are the refugees of failed uprisings, the descendants of pirates who misjudged a warp translation and never found their way back, the relic cults of 1,000 heresies that found at last their promised land. They build hive cities whose silhouettes are forests of spikes and flensed arches, where manufacturers stamp out munitions embossed with hexes and hungry sigils. In the sump levels, scavenger guilds dredge spent casings from rivers of brass. Above, the nobility wear masks of horn and lacquer, and auction prisoners by the hundred in arcades lit by soul lamps. Birth is a lottery of mutations. A child may blossom with chitinous plates, or wait to hear other minds as clearly as footfalls in snow. No one is surprised. The census is a hymn, not a ledger. Industry has its own priesthood, the Dark Mechanicum. Once the wayward sibling of the Imperium's tech priests, operate hell forges on worlds where volcanoes vent machine spirits with voices like choir organs. Here, engine seers unbolt the sacred strictures that once bound innovation and replaced reverence with appetite. Warp smiths graft demon essences into the heart of tanks, coax titans to walk with footsteps that leave fetid mist, and wire ships so their hulls shiver when near prey. In sub-basements lined with teeth, a gun is married to the thing that will hunger through its barrel. Every device is a compromise between function and desire. Every workshop smells faintly of incense and hot copper, and something faintly carnivorous. The legions do not remain legions for long. The eye unthreads certainties. Cohorts splinter into brotherhoods, brotherhoods into cults, cults into warbands with names that ring like curses. Warbands devoted to rage, to entropy, to change, to exquisite ruin. Others swear only to the idea of victory and spit on those who kneel to any one face of the infinite. Heraldry becomes a battlefield in itself, a palimpsest of grudges and victories laid over livery that once meant something simpler, a homeworld, a primarch, a creed. Now a champion wears a cape sewn from the oath parchment signed in the blood of a rival, and his helm bears an icon that did not exist there the year before. Fighting never truly stops. The eye is a sanctuary only in the sense that its walls keep others out. Inside, the knives are always out. Raids across rivers of glass for slaves, sorties into a neighbouring strata of reality to sack a shrine and throw its god idols into the sea. Secret wars waged entirely in dreamscapes over the ownership of a single syllable that unlocks a vault. Alliances are made the way bridges are, to cross an abyss, knowing full well that one day you will mine their supports. Blood duels settle points of punctuation in treaties. Massacres are commemorated with mosaics of bone. Yet, for all the destructive fury, there is a logic. Fractured, but persistent. Every warlord pays a tithe when certain omens align. Armories are emptied and granaries too. The forges scream. Slaves are branded with muster marks and herded into holds. Spies scuttle in and out with lists of names. Captains who would bend the knee, captains who will die for refusing. Captains who must be humiliated and then paraded for the sport of it. The eye breathes in, and the war bands draw close to hear the call no vox transmits. When a single banner rises high enough above the maelstrom, when a voice carries, oaths thread together into cables thick enough to haul worlds. The eye does not give armies, it condenses them. Recruitment is a word too gentle for what follows. On 100 hulk-strewn littorals, press gangs prowl with barbed nets, gathering the strong and the desperate. Chapels bloom like ulcers at crossroads, promising ascension by their service. Their sacristans measure skulls and scars, and decide which body will wear plate and which will be fed into the machine. Warp smiths open vats where things gestate that were once men. Apothecaries sort gene seeds stolen in a dozen ambushes and make soldiers out of blasphemy. Elsewhere, on a cliff that faces a sky made of knives, a sorcerer carves a warrior's true name into the air and exchanges it for a demon's attention. Not all who aspire survive the interview. Navigation is its own art. Maps are written in favours. A course is plotted by the memory of a prince of lies and amended by a bribe of a captain paid to a witch last century. There are currents that open when a certain constellation resembles a crown, and others that choke close when a million prayers are shouted on the same day. Some fleets sail behind heralds, greater entities whose passage calms the tides for a time. Others ride the wakes of titans, trusting that if the Leviathan made it through, the Krill may as well. When they return, they report to their lords in the halls with no doors, and their lords nod as if any of this is sane. Time does tricks in the sanctuary. Veterans who fought under a war master whose name is folklore elsewhere still oil their bolters and debate siege lines as if their last campaign ended yesterday. Sometimes it did. There are pockets where yesterday lasts a century. In others, an entire generation seasons within a single vicious week. The warbands harvest this distortion the way farmers once read the rain. Some realms are good for raising recruits fast, others are perfect for hiding a fleet until the hour is right. If there is law, it is written on the inside of a gauntlet. Strength articulates precedent. Cunning codifies loopholes. Piety, or at least the fidelity to one's patron, earns indulgences that exempt a warlord from a dozen inconveniences. Yet even the most favoured of them learn caution. The eye rewards zeal, but it also collects debts. A champion who leans too hard on a god's gift may find it repossessed in the moment it needs it most. A prince who trusts a demon's word will someday discover what adjective the demon attached to truth. And still the sanctuary thrives. Black markets roar under arches of flayed marble. Scribes with forked tongues draft contracts that bind fleets and families. Singers with iron throats practice the old cadences, the ones that turn crowds into armies. Children recite liturgies in which the names of hated foes are taught phonetically, syllable by syllable, so the curses will land cleanly when the day comes. It always comes. The eye is not a retirement, it is an arsenal under a bloody red sky. From time to time, scouts stand on bastions stitched into the rims of their world and look outwards, toward the cold stars. They watch the eddies along a certain corridor and count the sparks of translation flares. They measure the silence between distant beacons and whisper the numbers to augur priests who tally omens in ledgers bound in skin. When the sums agree, horns sound across citadels and dunes alike. Chains are hauled, anchors rise from mud that is not mud, 1,000 banners unroll from their staves and show teeth to the void. It is then that the sanctuary reveals what it truly is, not a hiding place, but a harbour, not a refuge from war, but the shipyard of it. The fleets lift, each prow painted with a prayer that is also a threat, and the foundries call at last. The eye exhales, the traitor sail. At the rim of the eye there is a single weakness, a corridor where the raging tides of unreality ease, where warp storms subside just enough to allow fleets to pass through without being shredded into nothing. It is narrow, treacherous, and ever shifting, but it is traversable. To the Imperium, that channel is the hinge upon which the survival of the galaxy turns. They named it the Cadian Gate, for the world that squats at its mouth has carried the burden of its watch for 10,000 years. Cadia was not chosen, it was drafted by geography and fate. When the heresy's embers cooled and the traitors were driven into exile, Imperial scouts realised that the eye's ruling circumference was sealed everywhere by impenetrable warp squalls. Only here, along this fragile corridor, could entire fleets of Chaos warlords emerge in ordered squadrons. If Cadia stood, the Imperium might survive. If Cadia fell, the galaxy would be open before the enemy like an unbarred vault. The Imperium turned that world into something more than a fortress. It turned it into a creed. Cities were built as bastions known as Cars, each a fortress unto itself, linked by lines of gun batteries and kill zones that spread across the planet's surface like veins of iron. Orbital stations hung above it in tight rings, their gun emplacements able to saturate the void with fire. Defence platforms girded the system's moons and asteroid belts. Shipyards grew vast, drawing ore from surrounding systems, turning the whole region into a militarised lattice. From orbit, Cadia resembled a planetary perpetually bristling with drawn weapons. But Cadia's greatest defence was not its walls, it was its people. From birth, every Cadian child was taught that war was not a matter of choice, but of existence. Toys were shaped like lasguns, lullabies were battle hymns, and training began before most could read. By adolescence, they were already drilled soldiers. By adulthood, they were regiments. To be born Cadian was to inherit an unbroken vigil stretching back generations. Their eyes bore the faint purple tinge of the eye's Iridian glare, and they wore that mark with grim pride. Where other worlds of the Imperium sent their youth reluctantly into the Guard, Cadia exported regiments as naturally as it exported grain or minerals. The Cadian shock troops became synonymous with discipline and firepower, their name carried to the farthest battlefronts of the Imperium. Cadia was not alone in this vigil. The surrounding sectors were layered in fortresses like the rings of a great bulwark. The Scarus sector, the Agrippina sector, Bellis Corona, each became cogs in a defensive network whose sole purpose was to bottle the eye's spawn. Entire battle fleets were permanently stationed here, drawn from the Segmentum Obscurus, their hulls etched with decades of combat against raiders or cultists. Forge worlds turned endlessly, pouring out ammunition and war engines. Even shrine worlds bore arms, their cathedrals doubling as readouts where pilgrims learned to chant battle prayers as readily as liturgies. The vigilance was necessary, for the eye did not rest. From its depths poured constant raiding parties, piratical fleets of renegades, demon ships that bled ichor into the void, and warbands that sought glory in sudden strikes. Many never reached Imperial space, torn apart by ambushes in the void or crushed on Cadia's defences. Others slipped through to ravage nearby systems before the Cadian fleets ran them down. Every such skirmish was measured in lives and blood, but it was the price of eternal watch. For 10 millennia the gate thundered with the drums of small wars. Yet sometimes the pressure grew too great. Sometimes the eye exhaled, not in raiding parties, but in storms. Entire legions of traitors gathered under banners blackened by chaos. Demonic hosts boiled outwards in legions, and warships emerged in squadrons large enough to darken suns. These were not raids, they were invasions. The Imperium called them Crusades of Darkness, but history remembers them more clearly as the Black Crusades of Abaddon. Each time, the Cadian Gate bore the brunt. Cadian regiments manned the cars to the last. Imperial Navy flotillas hurled themselves into the path of planet killers and demon engines. Reinforcements from across the Segmentum bled themselves white to hold the line. Sometimes they succeeded narrowly. Cadia left battered but unbroken. Sometimes entire sectors nearby were overrun, only reclaimed at terrible cost. But always Cadia stood. For as long as it did, the eye remained caged. What made Cadia unique was not merely its strength but its certainty. The Cadians did not ask why they fought, nor when would it end. They did not wonder whether peace might come. They knew, from the moment they could speak, that their lives were already pledged. Their fathers and mothers had fought, their children would fight after them. To be Cadian was to be a soldier until death, and to accept that death would almost certainly come in the shadow of the eye. That grim certainty forged them harder than adamantium. They did not break ranks, they did not waver. Their motto became a prophecy, whispered from trench to trench, shouted as last words upon crumbling walls. Cadia stands. From the eye's side, Cadia was seen differently. To the warlords of chaos, it was the lock barring the Imperium's heart. Every aspirant champion, every demon prince, every lord of heretics who dreamt of conquest knew that to march upon Terra, to see the throne itself, Cadia must be cast down first. Countless plots centred upon that single world. Sorcerers whispered curses to unseat its stones. War bands hurled themselves against its wall to make their mark. And traitor admirals wasted fleets in futile assaults just for the chance to leave a scar upon its soil. For the damned, Cadia was both obsession and obstacle, the one thing that could not be ignored. The world itself seemed to embody conflict. On its horizons the Eye of Terror hung always, a baleful wound burning the skies. Its citizens lived their entire lives under that hateful light. At night, the auroras of the warp painted their heavens in crimson and violet, a reminder of what always pressed against their gates. It bred in them not despair but defiance. They looked into the abyss every evening, and each morning they rose ready to deny it another day. The Cadian Gate thus became not just a strategic corridor but a symbol. To the Imperium at large, it was proof that humanity could resist even the most relentless foe. To hold the gate was to hold hope itself. Pilgrims journeyed to its shrine citadels to see the warriors who had never lost. Commanders on distant worlds invoked its name to steal their troops. Cadia was more than a fortress world. It was the idea that mankind could plant its feet upon the edge of hell and refuse to be moved. And so, century after century, the vigil endured. Fleets patrolled the void, cars bristled with guns, soldiers drilled on parade grounds that overlooked the storm. Each generation lived as if it would be the one to finally see the end of Cadia, yet each generation also swore that if it must fall, they would fall standing. The gate never closed, but neither did it yield. For 10,000 years, the Imperium and the Eye stared at one another across the narrow corridor, each testing, each waiting. The guards stood to their posts, the fleet to their stations, and the prayers of a million voices rose daily to the Emperor that Cadia would endure one day longer. Because all knew the truth. If Cadia ever broke, the gate would be open, and the storm would come roaring out to drown the galaxy. They call it a storm when 1,000 raiders spill from the Eye and fall upon the shipping lanes. They call it a war when a sector burns for a year and the astropaths scream themselves blind. But a Black Crusade is something else. It is the moment the howling inside the Eye finds a single throat and speaks in command. The moment 100 rival warlords lower their banners and align their guns to a rhythm older than their grudges. It is the long war given spear tip and direction, and its master is a figure whose shadow runs like a crack through 10 millennia. Abaddon the Despoiler. He began not with a triumph but with thefts and funerals. From the scattered wreckage of treason he collected survivors who still remembered how to march in step, stripped them of their name that had failed them, and dressed them in night. The Black Legion was not a patchwork of broken oaths but a new oath entirely, a promise to keep fighting until the memory of submission was ground into dust. Champions came one by one, testing the resolve of the one who wore the talon and the War Master's sneer. They left either kneeling or not at all. In time, the murmur turned to a chant. When the Despoiler called, they would answer. The first call came like a knife drawn across a drumhead. Warbands rose from demon-lit dry docks. Renegade flotillas shook off barnacles of half-reality and formed into neat, hateful lines. The Eye coughed a fleet into the corridor, and the galaxy learned a new phrase, Black Crusade, by watching the mouths of officers who could not quite believe that their augurs had showed them. That opening thrust was not meant to shatter the Imperium, not yet. It was a test of sinew and a hunt for a prize. Worlds at the mouth of the corridor spat fire from orbitals and burned their own skies to ash. Fortress garrisons wrote their histories in blood and stubbornness. In the chaos of the first battles, the Despoiler found what he sought, a blade whose edge was a question mark over reality itself, a demon bound to iron and hate. With that sword in hand, his promise to the dark was sealed, and the ledger of the Imperium gained a new column, debts to be collected later. He learned quickly that to batter the bastions forever was a waste of strength, so the next surges were asymmetrical and cruel. Some crusades were abrupt strokes that opened arteries the Imperium had forgotten it possessed. Others were long tortures that bent supply lines until they snapped. The Administratum labelled them numerically, as if numbering tempests would tame them. The soldiers who fought through them learned to tell the difference between a raid meant to bleed a world and a campaign that carried a deeper design. When the Despoiler turned his attention to holy sites, the faithful cried desecration. When he struck at forges and data crypts, the Mechanicus cried sacrilege. When he turned aside mid-campaign to reap gene seed from a chapter bled white on an anvil world, the Astartes learned that even their legacy was not beyond his appetite. Every stroke fed a larger calculus. Patterns emerged for those with patience to look beyond the smoke. In some theatres, ancient pylons of alien make flickered and died under bombardment that seemed wasteful until the aftershocks rolled through the warp like a groan of a hull under strain. In others, a fortress that should have been bypassed was reduced stone by stone simply because beneath its foundation slept a device of uncertain purpose, a keystone in a lattice that held back tides no mortal chart acknowledged. The Despoiler's map was not inked on paper, but on the skin of reality, and he was patient enough to score it line by line. The Crimson Path, some called it later, as if giving it a name made the horror less deliberate. Not every crusade was a ritt across a dozen sectors, some were intimate horrors. A fleet translated into an unsuspecting subsector, and before astropaths could find the words for their terror, worlds were cut out like coupons, populations vanished into chains, manufactoria stripped to frames. Other crusades were ostentatious, spectacular acts of butchery designed to lure relief forces into layered traps, a shrine world burning, a martyrdom staged so convincingly that 3 chapters and an entire navy battle group ran full speed into a gauntlet of minefields and demon engines, leaving wreckage that took decades to clear. He didn't need to win every battle, he needed to win the ones that moved the needle. Then came the war that taught governors to whisper his name with reverence and hate, the great conflagration that lit the Gothic sector. To the Imperium it was the 12th. To those who survived it, it was a lesson in how an enemy can reach back through time and borrow a weapon from a vanished age. Ancient fortresses, vast drifting monoliths of alien manufacture, were woken and leashed. Their beams carved crescents into worlds, their mere presence deranged the tides of the warp, and people learned that a fortress can be a god if it's old enough. The Despoiler did not keep them all, but he did not need to. He learned how they sang, and he left with enough music to score another movement of his grand design. When he withdrew, Imperial voxnets blared victory hymns. The choir masters could not hear the new cracks in the firmament. Between these great convulsions lay quieter violences. A chapter fortress monastery woke to find its vault open from the inside by a traitor's smile, and its gene seed stacked like ingots on a heretic's altar. A forge world spent a year under a sky of black snow as techno-heresy ate its machine spirits from within. Its adepts survive, chastened, but the patterns the Despoiler stole from their Barco archives turned up centuries later in a super weapons architecture. An agri-world that fed 3 subsectors for 100 years reported a bumper harvest, and then nothing. Rescue fleets found neat rows of bones standing like crops, each skull drilled and labelled in a script that rusted the eyes. These were footnotes in the Administratum ledgers. In the eye, these were prayers answered. The Black Legion were not the only instruments. The Despoiler understood that chaos wears many faces, and that each could be made to look towards the same horizon if the light was right. Berserkers marched where the slaughter was the point. Plague legions made sieges into harvests. Sorcerers opened doors where walls were thickest. Cults bloomed like mould ahead of the main thrusts, softening targets with rites and assassinations. Renegade titans were lured from retirement with feasts of sacrilege. Pirate princes were promised a decade's spoil if they could choke a single naval passage for a single week. He turned war the way an artisan turns a clock, some parts huge and obvious, others so fine you would miss them unless you knew the sound they were supposed to make. To the defenders, it was like drowning in orders. One year the expectation was to hold the line with iron discipline, the next to abandon worlds by design and trade space for time. After that, to strike deep with spear-tip offensives that gambled entire fleets on a guess gleaned from the Emperor's tarot. Generals rose and fell by the month, heroes burned like mayflies in a furnace. Meanwhile, the quiet work continued. Listening stations lost contact and were written off, nav beacons flickered and were logged for maintenance. Pilgrim routes were temporarily rerouted around disturbances that never settled. A great animal was being bled, pint by pint, so slowly it kept walking. And always the eye watched, measured the panic it caused, and after each crusade, the Despoiler counted what he had gained and what he had taught the enemies to fear. He learned the timings of reinforcement cycles in 3 segmenta. He learned how long the Astra Telepathica could maintain coherence in a quadrant under sustained empiric pressure. He learned which chapters would rush to which calls and how bitterly they would fight one another if the bait was set cleverly. Knowledge is a weapon when you intend to fight for a long time, and he intended to fight until the ledger was balanced. His war was a patient heresy against the future. When he was forced back, it was rarely for lack of ferocity, it was often because he had already taken what he came for. A relic that folded space like cloth, a data slate of pre-imperial engineering formula, a rumour etched into a saint's bones. He left false trails of triumph behind him, trophies that cost the Imperium dearly to reclaim and offered no relief when the next darkness fell. In victory and seeming defeat, he made deposits into the same account. By the end of the 41st millennium, the ledger's columns were aligned. The Eye's tides were higher than anyone remembered. Maps needed new margins. Old safeguards were gone, and the new ones were untested. As if to mark the moment, omens multiplied. The kind that made seasoned admirals cross themselves in empty bridges. Whole sectors went quiet in ways that felt like a held breath. The Despoiler's banner did not appear on every front, it did not need to. Across a breadth that defied strategy, his agents relayed a simple message: gather. The forges inside the Eye became suns, the docks became forests of iron. The warbands that had learned over centuries to grind one another for sport took their places in a formation too large to comprehend. They say there is a sound a blade makes when it hits bone after a long arc, a full-bodied note that tells the hand the strike has landed. The galaxy heard that sound when the 13th came, but that is in another chapter. Here, at the beginning, it is enough to understand that the Black Crusades were not 13 storms but 13 movements in a single, terrible symphony, the overture to a wound being taught how to swallow. For 10,000 years, Cadia had been the stone in the storm, the bastion that would not fall. 11 times the Despoiler had hurled his legions against it in fury. 11 times the banners of chaos had been cast back into the Eye, tattered but unconsumed. The Imperium took grim solace in this pattern, whispering the gate could never be prized open so long as Cadia's guns remained. But the war is patient, and Abaddon's patience was deeper than the void itself. When the 13th Black Crusade came, it did not come like the others. It came like an avalanche that had been building for centuries, unstoppable, crushing, inevitable. The storm broke first in silence. Astropathic choirs across Segmentum Obscurus convulsed with visions of burning thrones, of stars bleeding into black oceans, Navis nobility charts twisted in their hands, courses collapsing into mazes. Warp routes once steady as highways bored with interference, as if the Eye's edge had swollen outward. Then, like a wound tearing wider, the fleets emerged. Hundreds of warships, demon engines veiled in empiric flame, renegade squadrons massed under the Eye's shadow. The size of the host was beyond comprehension. Where once Abaddon had struck in sudden fury and pulled back, now he advanced with the inevitability of the tide. Cadia was the fulcrum of his wrath. Its fortress cities bristled, its orbital guns spat fire, its void shields flared like suns. The Cadian shock troops stood in their trenches, chanting the litany that had outlasted centuries. Cadia stands. And stand they did, against an onslaught that might have shattered a segmentum. Warbands of every stripe poured into the gate. Their banners a patchwork of damnation, berserkers roaring for blood, plague legions trailing clouds of contagion, demonic hosts shimmering with unholy colour, titans stepping across continents with ground-shaking strides. The first battles were in the void, as the Imperial Navy locked itself against the tide. Battlefleet Obscurus, reinforced by ships from half this segmentum, fought in lines of fire that stretched across the stars. For every cruiser lost to a demon ship's ramming charge, another was rammed home in reply. Entire squadrons died to buy minutes for the orbital stations to fire, but no fleet, no matter how brave, could halt the tide alone. The blockade shattered under sheer weight, and the war spilled out into Cadia itself. The fortress world became a carnal house. Cars after cars became a battlefield, every boulevard a killing ground, every hab block a readout. For months the war raged, the lines surging back and forth across the planet's surface. Regiments bled themselves white in counterattack after counterattack, recapturing ground only to lose it the next day. Titans strode through firestorms, laying waste to entire city districts in jewels of god machines. The skies became thick with the smoke of burning voidcraft and the screams of descending drop pods. Each dawn saw the walls still standing, though fewer men lived to hold them. And then the Despoiler revealed his true weapon. He had not merely come with fleets and legions, he had come with relics of another age, the Blackstone fortresses he had claimed in earlier crusades. Ancient constructs vast as moons, their power was to warp the warp itself, to focus empiric tides into lances of annihilation. With them, Abaddon struck not only at the fleets but at the foundations of reality. Warp currents twisted, imperial reinforcements found routes cut off, and Cadia was isolated at the very moment it needed the galaxy's strength. The Blackstones hung over the system like executioners, their beams cracking apart orbital bastions that had stood for centuries. Still Cadia fought. The creed of its people was defiance, and they would not betray it. Lord Castellan Osaka Creed orchestrated the defence with brilliance, shuffling regiments where the line was thinnest, counter-attacking when they least expected, and bleeding the enemy at every step. Saint Celestine herself descended into the firestorm, wings blazing, a living beacon of the Emperor's will, rallying the broken and raising the fallen to fight anew. Space Marine chapters answered the call, their banners unfurled beside the Cadians, bolters roaring in defiance of the dark. For a time, it seemed even the Despoiler's tide might break upon the rock once more, but Abaddon's design went deeper still. The pylons of Cadia, vast ancient structures of Xenos design that rose across the planet's surface, had long been a mystery. To most, they were relics, monuments whose purpose was forgotten. To Abaddon, they were keys. These pylons formed part of a lattice that suppressed the warp's tide, a bulwark against the eye's expansion. So long as they stood, the eye remained contained. If they could be broken, the storm would spill outward unchecked. That was the Despoiler's true aim, not merely Cadia's death, but reality's unravelling. The Blackstone fortresses turned their beams upon the pylons. One by one, the titanic structures cracked and crumbled. With each collapse, the warp surged stronger. Demons poured more freely into real space, their forms no longer flickering but solid, their voices thunderous. The Cadians fought desperately to defend the pylons, hurling themselves into battles where the ground boiled within reality, but weight of fire and sorcery tore the defences apart. Even as they died, they bought time, each stand delaying the inevitable by a precious minute. In the war's climax, the ground itself betrayed them. The Blackstone's fury tore at Cadia's mantle, shattering their crust, and the planet began to die. Great chasms split open, swallowing whole regiments. Oceans bored into the void, cars that had stood for millennia crumbled into the abyss. Still the defenders fought, firing until their magazines were empty, charging with bayonets when their guns were gone, refusing to yield even as the ground fell beneath their boots. Cadia stands, they cried, even as Cadia fell. At last the world cracked apart entirely, its fragments hurled into the void, its atmosphere ripped into fire. The eye surged, a tidal wave of unreality spilling outward as the lattice of pylons failed. The Cadian Gate was no more, the lock was broken, the corridor blown open. Yet even in the destruction, the defenders achieved something no prophecy foretold. They denied the Despoiler his complete victory. Cadia had fallen, but it had not yielded cheaply. Abaddon's fleets, though triumphant, were bloodied. His Blackstone fortresses had spent their fury. The Imperium's champions escaped into the storm, carrying with them the story of Cadia's last stand, a story that would echo across the stars. The fall of Cadia was more than a fall of a world. It was the shattering of certainty. For 10,000 years, men had believed that as long as Cadia stood, so too would the Imperium endure. Now that certainty was gone. The eye yawned wider, its tides spilling unchecked across the stars. The Great Rift was born, a wound that split the galaxy in two, severing whole sectors from Terra's light. The long war had entered a new stage, and the Imperium entered an age of darkness deeper than any it had known. Yet in the ashes of Cadia's ruin, one truth remained unbroken. In their final hour, when the sky collapsed and the seas boiled, the defenders had stood their ground. They had fought until the last gun fell silent, until the last stone was ash. They had kept faith with their creed, and though their world was gone, their cry endured across the galaxy. Cadia stands. When Cadia cracked and the pylons fell, the Eye of Terror did not stop at swallowing a single world. Its scream tore deeper, a shriek that rippled across the galaxy, splitting the skein of reality from rim to rim. The Imperium surged outward, drowning whole star systems beneath waves of unreality. What had once been a wound became a canon, and what had once been a frontier storm became a tide that bisected the galaxy itself. In its wake stretched the Citrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a gash of living madness that burned across the heavens like a scar of blood and lightning. For those that beheld it from afar, the rift was an impossible sight. A great wound of fire spanning the firmament, visible with the naked eye across the void. From high-wheeled balconies and shrine spires, mortals lifted their gaze and wept to see the stars themselves swallowed. Some fell to their knees in awe, believing the Emperor's end had come. Others screamed in horror, for the rift seemed a mouth opening wide, ready to devour everything. To sailors of the void, it was a death sentence. Warp travel across its breadth was impossible. Astropathic choirs fell silent, their messages cut off as if drowned beneath an ocean. Trade routes that had lasted for millennia vanished overnight. The Imperium was sundered. Whole swaths of humanity awoke to find themselves cut off from Terra, marooned on the far side of a living scar. The Astronomicon, the beacon that had guided ships across the Sea of Souls, flickered and failed across vast tracts of space, leaving navigators blind. For millions of worlds, the galaxy had gone dark. They called it the Dark Imperium, the half beyond the rift, where Terra's light could not reach, where communication was silence and relief fleets never came. On those worlds, terror reigned. With the warp's tide spilling unchecked, reality frayed. Planets found their skies awash in auras that burned with demonic faces. Nightmares spilled into waking life. Time twisted, with days stretching into years or collapsing into minutes. Whole continents slipped sideways into unreality, replaced by landscapes out of fever dreams. Demonic incursions multiplied, no longer fleeting but sustained, for the rift gave them permanence. Cults rose like weeds, claiming that the gods of the warp had at last triumphed and offering worship in exchange for survival or power. For many imperial governors, their thrones became prisons, their words meaningless against the rising tide. The warp surge did not discriminate. Aeldari craft worlds were shaken as if caught in earthquakes of the soul. Orc empires, so used to riding the tides of battle, found themselves carried into new wars without warning. Even the Necrons, long insulated by their cold, unliving technology, felt the strain, for the rift's turbulence clawed at their status crypts and awoke tombs prematurely. No corner of the galaxy was free of its echo. But it was the Imperium that suffered most, for its unity had always depended on the thin threads of faith, bureaucracy, and warp travel. With the rift, those threads snapped. Star systems starved as grain fleets never arrived. Forge worlds fell silent without raw ore shipments, and hive worlds choked in their own filth. Administratum offices burned as desperate clerks destroyed records they could no longer deliver. The ecclesiarchy declared days of penitence so long they became years, priests whipping congregators to atone for sins no one could name. In the absence of orders from Terra, many governors declared themselves independent lords, forming petty empires in the dark. Others fell into despair, committing planetary suicide rather than face what lay beyond the rift. Yet for Chaos, the rift was a triumph beyond imagining. Where once the Eye of Terror had been a single gaping wound, now the galaxy itself bled. Demons poured through in endless legions, unbound by the pylons that had once checked their passage. The followers of the Dark Gods claimed it as a sign of ascendance, the gods' will made manifest in the skies of every world. Abaddon's legions surged outward, exploiting the chaos, carving new dominions in the Dark Imperium where Imperial resistance was weakest. Demon worlds multiplied, thriving in pockets of unreality. The Long War was no longer confined to a frontier, it was everywhere. In the midst of this storm, the Imperium's hope was stretched to breaking. Entire sectors vanished from the cartographers of Terra. Systems that had once answered daily astropathic communications now lay silent for decades. The High Lords of Terra struggled to assert their control, their decrees taking years to reach those who still lived. The Great Rift was not merely a wound in space, it was a wound in faith. Millions of the Emperor's subjects despaired, believing him dead, his light extinguished. Riots consumed shrine worlds, cults multiplied by the day, their whispered prayers louder than the sermons of priests. And yet, even here, humanity's stubbornness endured. On the far side of the rift, worlds clung to the Emperor's name like drowning men to driftwood. Cadian survivors, though their world was gone, became symbols of defiance, their cry of Cadia stands adopted as a rallying oath by a galaxy in darkness. Space Marine chapters cut off from Terra waged their wars alone, carving out bastions of light amid the dark, swearing that even without orders their duty endured. On Forge worlds cut adrift, tech priests lit their furnaces with prayers instead of oil, forging weapons in hope that reinforcements might one day come. The Dark Imperium was fractured, bleeding, but not silent. Its worlds fought on, each a flickering candle in an endless night. For the Aeldari, the rift was an omen and curse alike. To them, it was the fulfillment of their ancient doom, the echo of the fall magnified across the galaxy. Yet it also gave birth to hope, for within its ties they saw strands of fate twisting toward a new possibility, the rise of Enid, the whispering god of the dead. To the Orcs, the rift was a gift, a never-ending wellspring of battle, drawing them like moths to a flame. To the Necrons, it was an aberration to be exorcised, a disruption of the natural order they sought to seal with their cold alien silences. The galaxy groaned under its weight, but in every species, responses took form. Still, none can deny the galaxy had changed forever. The Eye of Terror was no longer a distant horror confined to Segmentum Obscurus. It was now stretched across every sector, every world. For the Rift was its child, its expansion, its legacy. Where once the Imperium had relied on fortress worlds and naval patrols to cage the Eye, there was now no cage. The wound was too vast, too raw. The Imperium was not holding the gate anymore, the gate had been kicked wide open. In the halls of Terror, the High Lords debated endlessly, sending fleets where they could, sacrificing sectors to save others. In the Dark Imperium, worlds prayed for deliverance, watching the rift burn in their skies like a permanent eclipse. And in the Eye itself, the warlords of chaos laughed, for their gods had at last imposed their truth upon the stars. The galaxy was no longer one, it was two, divided by a scar of madness, its halves struggling to recognise one another across a gulf of demons and silence. In that darkness, new legends would be born, new wars ignited, new hopes kindled. The age of the Imperium was over, the age of the rift had begun. You have peered into the abyss, and the abyss has peered back. The Eye of Terror is no tale with an ending, but a scar that endures, a reminder that chaos is eternal and its shadows fall on every star. If you would stand against it, strike the seal of subscription and march with the faithful, for the long wars rage on and every voice matters. This has been Dominissimo. Until the next broadcast, still your soul, for the eye never closes.